You may well have heard that lab-grown meat is just around the corner. Well, it seems that could be just the start. Scientists are now saying that all kinds of food will be produced through clever chemistry, and that is definitely going to change the way we eat. Welcome to Roundtable. And a very warm welcome to the programme from me, David Foster. Forget animals, forget plants. Our food will soon be grown from cells produced in a laboratory, perhaps even in a factory. And scientists who are pushing new technology say that could well transform the way we feed the entire world.
The climate crisis could end if farmed food was replaced by food grown in the laboratory. That is the claim being made by some environmentalists as developments in food science begin to take off. Scientists say cells and bacteria can be used to create all kinds of food, from staples like flour to proteins like meat and fish. A recent study by think tank Rethink X says laboratory-made, protein-based food would be healthier, 10 times cheaper, and could lead to the collapse of the livestock industry by 2035. Livestock are responsible for about 14.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. But the livestock sector also contributes massively to the global economy, up to 40% of agricultural output, according to the UN. It also supports the livelihoods, food and nutrition security of almost 1.3 billion people. So how seriously should we take the idea of lab-grown food?
Allow me to introduce the roundtable guest today, Catherine Tubb from the think tank Rethink X, who says the new food economy will replace the livestock industry sooner than we think. Neil Stevens with us, Research Fellow in Sociology and Science and Technology Studies at Brunel University of London, who believes the relationship between traditional farming and the cultured meat industry has been tricky to balance. Louise Manning, we welcome her back again, Professor of Agri-Food and Supply Chain Security at Royal Agricultural University, and then Daniel Jones from the food campaign group Feedback, who says there is a risk in so-called tech food. I'd like to call it biotech food, in a sense, because it's more than just technology, isn't it? But, Catherine, let me start with you first, and everybody can chip in whenever they wish. George Monbiot, Apocalypse Cow, the documentary, who says after 12,000 years of feeding humankind, all farming, except fruit and veg, is likely to be replaced by fermentation. All production on farms, except fruit and veg.
Yeah.
Is that likely?
Yeah, very likely. In our report, we forecast that by 2030, and really by 2035, all kind of industrial farming is going to be replaced by fermentation. We actually don't forecast all. We probably have a 90% adoption rate. We still think there may well be a place for regenerative farming or more like local
So traditional farming as it used to be before it was
yes, that's probably a good way of
transformed to an
thinking about it.
industrial...
Yeah, kind of artisanal farming. So, you know, more kind of local production of having a few cows, a few pigs, a few horses. And
you teach, Catherine, Louise, sorry, some of the farmers of the future.
Yes.
Down there. What is their view of this? Do they think there's really little point? If it's apocalyptic, as George Monbiot says, perhaps as Catherine suggests, is there any future in what they're doing?
I think there's a great future in producing natural food. It's going to come down to whether food is produced naturally or whether people eat synthetic, fake food.
Is lab-grown meat fake food?
That is what society will have to decide. And if you look at how society has addressed genetically modified food in the past, especially in Europe, I think there's a real discussion that has to be had around some of these foods that are going to be, or ingredients are going to be produced. If I'm eating a biscuit and I have what is equivalent to a dairy protein in my biscuit, am I going to worry if that came from a cow or not? Probably not. If I'm giving liquid milk to my child, am I going to think a little bit more that a yeast made that product? I could do. So I think it's going to be very much food specific.
But do you think your farmers, your student farmers at the moment, will go into industrial style, industrial grade in terms of scale farming, or will that have gone, as Catherine and the others suggest?
I don't think it will be gone in that period of time, no.
Okay. What about this idea is it's got to be socially acceptable?
Well, absolutely. Politically, socially, the way people within the community that are making these technologies present it, they very much focus on consumer acceptance, which sort of positions it as a yes/no buying decision. But I'm tempted to think that it's a broader policy, political discussion about that, about what you want the future to look like. I really do think that the food industry will undergo types of change with and without these types of technologies. But I think it's very hard to predict what they will look like. But the sort of issues you're talking about, a kind of a mandate for doing this kind of work is an important theme that deserves more attention.
But again, technically possible. Could you feed the world, do you think, with what's being proposed in these different laboratories?
I would be much more cautious than the kind of line that Catherine's giving about the speed with which this could come into being. I'm also cautious about the technological capacity of some of the technologies. Some of them look closer than others. Some of the ones that are about specific proteins in milks, for example, seem to me to be easier to deliver than full sort of tissue steaks, sausages, things like that.
I reckon sausages first and then it'll be steaks and proper fish. Can we get into the technological side of it in just a while? But Daniel, what are the risks that you see in this?
So the reason that we're here having this discussion today is that I think there's probably broad agreement that the way we produce food has a massive environmental, social, society-wide impact, and that we think that radical or, well, at least I think radical, more generally we feel that the food system needs to change, and that in particular meat and dairy produced on an industrial scale has an outsized environmental impact compared to other parts of the food system.
OK, so you agree the system's wrong, it needs to be changed.
Absolutely.
What's wrong with this solution?
Broadly, I think it slightly misunderstands the nature of the problem, and it's putting a product first rather than designing something that is, to want of a slogan, people and planet orientated. So just to give two really kind of quick examples, there's huge diversity in our food system. There's a massive difference between a smallholder farmer in Mozambique who owns 2 cows and a meat and dairy giant like Tyson Foods that slaughters 30,000 head of cattle each day. And the big risk that at least I see is faux optimism. And that's the fact that
Sorry, what sort of optimism?
Faux optimism,
Okay.
fake optimism,
Yeah.
is like, in some ways, the foods are. The difficulty here is people will continue to buy in and invest in existing systems that cause environmental impact whilst hoping that some technology is going to save us at a point down the line. We've been here before. There was huge optimism in the 1950s around chlorella, like this magic algae that was going to feed the whole world. We don't know how these technologies are going to get adopted. It's not just the case because there is a market for the product that the product is a good idea.
OK, and Louise, we'll come back to the impact on farming as we know it today. OK, so the general agreement is, and please, at any time, anybody can say anything, general agreement is that it all got a bit too big, and it's all taking up too much land, and it's creating problems. If, as Daniel suggests, it's very difficult to know exactly where this will go, that there's only reason to be optimistic at the moment, what if this doesn't work?
We don't really come from it as a solution-orientated think tank. We actually look at technological-driven disruptions. And so what we do is look at more on the supply side, look at how technology is improving, both in cost and capability, and what that means. So we haven't said, oh, how are we going to feed the world and what's the answer? We've actually looked at it from the technology and looked at all the technologies that are impacting our whole food system. And we've come across this one that we think is basically on the cusp of being truly disruptive with bulk animal proteins.
Do you want to throw in some of the other ones that you reckon could be goers?
I mean, people talk about vertical farming, but kind of indoor farming and improvement. But
This is
precision
skyscraper
farming.
farms, is it?
Yeah, I mean, there are a few issues with that. This is the one that we see has the most kind of, I'd say, fewest hurdles to overcome in terms of technological hurdles that might...
Now throw out there, Catherine, if you would, the reasons why a change is vital, in your opinion.
But again, it's not about whether it's vital. What we think is this is inevitable. The cost and capability of producing proteins is going to be hitting that of how we produce them via animals by 2025. It's just going to be cheaper and easier, and you can do it anywhere, and it's just going to outperform the cow. So basically what we're saying is, look, how we produce proteins via animals at the moment is a technology. The animals are the technologies, and we can do better than that. Just as the horse was disrupted by the car in the early 1900s, we're going to see that happen. It's just a technology thing. And it's because it's ingredient-led, as Louise said, like we have dairy and biscuits, but once you can replace those little bits of dairy proteins, the whole system's going to implode. We've seen that with the 2 high-profile bankruptcies in the US, Dean Foods and Borden, who are 2 big dairy processors. And so we've seen how kind of on a knife edge these industries and some of these industries are, and how economically kind of unfeasible they are. And that's what we see. So part of the reason we think it's going to happen so quickly is because once you take out a little bit of that demand, you're just going to see kind of an implosion on the system. And
Is it like a sandcastle when the tide comes in?
A little bit, yeah. So, I mean, that's kind of an S-curve disruption of how we think about disruptions, exponentials. That's a lot of what our think tank is about. We look at these exponential-driven disruptions. And that's where we're coming from. We're not saying it needs to be solved. We're just saying this technology is coming.
OK, and I'm wondering about scale, because Georges Monbiot, anybody can come in, and Georges Monbiot says he reckons they could grow enough of these microbes to produce proteins through electrolysis and splitting the molecules in water, the hydrogen and the oxygen, in a place the size of Ohio to feed the world. I mean, that sounds impossible, but which part of the world? That's one of the other problems, isn't it, sociologically? How are you going to get this down to the poorest countries in Africa? Because they still will have to rely on this kind of farming.
Yeah, absolutely. There's clearly a global politics around this. There's questions to be asked about who is owning the technology, what are they seeking to accomplish with the technology, if the technology goes on to be successful. I'm not as convinced as you are of the inevitability of this. I think that's a very strong word. In part because of, what is it? What does the system look like? It's inevitable, but what actual form does it take in terms of the global distribution of power, in terms of what types of products are being produced and the extent to which they are or not related and entangled with existing food production, existing agriculture? I think there's more questions than answers.
Jump in.
So I would say that because of urbanisation and more people living on this planet, living in cities than in rural areas, we already have a disconnect between what people eat in cities and what historically or traditionally we would class as food. They're already eating highly processed foods, and we see the rise of obesity and other diet-related illnesses as a result. So this has the potential to address some of those highly processed foods. These ingredients, because that's essentially what we're looking at, will either be ingredients in highly processed foods or they will form part of animal feed. That will, if that is socially acceptable, which will then replace the real challenge we have in Europe in that we don't have enough.
So it could be
plant
better
protein.
for us, in a sense, as long as it's managed properly.
I think there are some positives. If we look at Europe as a whole, we currently have a real issue around the fact that there isn't enough protein to feed the livestock in Europe, so we're bringing it from all around the world. This potentially, if we look at animal feed specifically, has some very key benefits. But then we have to remember that it's only 5-10 years ago that the general public were very concerned about animals being fed genetically modified ingredients.
OK, so there's a very long way to go. Catherine, I believe you say that proteins done this way will be 1/10 of the price of those we get at the moment. But there's going to be an issue, is there not, with the cost of the energy that is used to produce this?
Potentially. It really does depend on how the technology pans out. There's been some modelling done at the University of Oxford about various scenarios. We've got to be really careful, particularly with, say, ruminant livestock, cows, etc., that we're not swapping methane emissions, which are relatively short-lived, for longer-term carbon dioxide emissions that are driven by the energy use, because these products will take quite a substantial amount of energy. All of this is fairly speculative.
Thinking just from the systems as it is now, also into how the energy system is going to change. So, for example, we know now that solar panels are already cheaper than, like, fossil fuels. So it is likely in 10 years' time, and also this is another report we're about to put out on energy and solar energy. And solar energy plus batteries will also replace fossil fuels. So if suddenly you're changing not just transport, not just energy, but food, they all come together to release all these possibilities, right? And that's what we try and think about as a think tank, the systemic kind of
Well, come back and talk to us about that one, because one of the other arguments against solar panels is they take up an awful lot of land, and one of the arguments against cows, the arguments against cows is that they also take up an awful lot of land. But you reckon 1/10 of the price. What about the fact that within 20 years, or say roughly that period, we are going to need so much more water for the way we produce food at the moment? 20% more water by 2050, is that right?
I don't know that figure, but I do know this technology. Well, so also this technology, right, just as an example, has already come down from about $1 million per kilo in year 2000 to about $100 per kilo today.
Yeah, the first burger was £200,000.
Yeah, I mean, we're not talking about burgers, we're talking about this particular technology, but it's very similar. You see that kind of cost curve, right? So the idea that this is going to be 10 times cheaper is not kind of, we're not being aggressive about our forecasts in that way. But yeah, and then in terms of the inputs, so it's not just kind of part of the cost is based on the inputs, and all the inputs are going to come down. How much water, energy, fuel, feedstock do we use for cows? If you can reduce that by an order of magnitude, that has a huge impact on land. So again, that opens up these questions, thinking about what are the implications of this technology. It could be to open up the land. How much more land are we going to have? Also, if we move to a kind of electric autonomous system, we're going to have a lot more land from cars as well. There's going to be fewer cars on the road. So then it kind of opens up how much land and what can we use that land for? Well, maybe solar panels or rewilding, or there's all these choices that we have to make, and it's important that we have these discussions now.
Don't you think it's a very urban discussion, though?
Yeah,
It's about
definitely.
feeding urban people. If you look at rural areas, we will still need cars to move. We will still...
Will we?
Yes.
Why?
Well, if you live in the back of Beyond,
Why?
Not necessarily, if you can call up a
unless you can
cars.
fly.
Uber doesn't exist where I live.
Yet.
Uber does not
Yet.
exist. It will
Yet.
not exist.
I take your point. So say that 95% of, and let's just take the developing world out at the moment, but the developed world switch to this technology, that's still a disruption. Disruption does not mean destruction. So there may well still be...
OK, I'm going to jump in here because we're talking about disruption. We're talking about whether society will accept... Let me go to you first of all on this one. 1.2 million jobs lost. This is from your report by 2030. 700,000 jobs created. That's a net loss of 500,000 jobs. That is, I think that's in the United States.
Yeah.
That's not worldwide. No. I mean, how are people in any country going to accept that this is good, but they're going to lose their jobs? There's going to be resistance, isn't there?
Absolutely. It's relatively straightforward to maybe have this conversation in a country which's economy doesn't really rely so heavily on agriculture for its, its economy as, for example, say Sierra Leone, where 60% of its GDP is reliant on agriculture. We need to think about whose voices are getting heard within this debate. We need to think about the ways in which technology could change power dynamics within the food system, and that really needs to be front and centre with the way that any policy architectural response is put forward for this.
Completely agree with that.
OK, what about this? Food is not just fuel, is it? It isn't in many places, many parts of the world, it is essentially a fuel. But in the first world, developed world, whatever you want to call it, it has become a luxury, it has become a hobby to change people's way that they think about food. Is not just because of economics. There might be reluctance as well.
Oh, absolutely. I think that the role of food culture could be quite important. This food culture is very real. It's tied to identity, how people think about themselves, how they think about their communities, how they think about the people whose spaces they share or don't share, but empathise with, be that farmers or people in rural communities. And also that's tied to power, right? There's other sites where there are people who I anticipate being resistant to these technologies. And we do need to be aware that we're talking about a category of technologies. There's quite a few different technologies that we're sort of throwing together a little bit in this conversation at times. But I do anticipate that there will also be, and we're starting to see, kind of active sites of people who are either questioning some of these technologies or are actively hostile to some of these technologies.
And why are they hostile to it? Because of their livelihood or because of culture?
I think it's quite diverse. I think the two things are very much interlinked. I do think that we've already seen examples of some people within the livestock industry raising concerns about this technology. Certainly with cultured meat, this idea that this is fake meat in an attempt to sort of stigmatise the naturalness of it. I think food culture is a real thing that frames people's practices, but I think it's malleable, I think it can change, and I think it always has changed.
OK, what about the idea that actually since the day our first human walked upon this planet, that person, he, she, they, multiples thereafter, have eaten food, and now they're just going to be recharging themselves and refueling themselves?
The idea that there will be resistance to this, I think, is very, very, very true. I think ultimately for me it comes down to the way that we produce and consume food says something broader about the society that we're in. And I look at these technologies and think, in some ways, they're trying to change everything so everything can stay the same. It is directly substituting one thing, a meat, for a meat analogue that's identical without actually asking broader questions about the food system that we're in. And so to your point on, that switch from food to fuel, I think in some ways what hides behind that question is we're basically redefining something in a way that we're not yet quite.
And if we don't redefine it, will we make ourselves extinct? And I'm going to come on to the farming question in just a moment. But OK, Louise, you answer that one.
I don't think we'll make ourselves extinct. I think there's an element of equity, that if we think of who will be consuming these cheap food products, there'll be people who financially will be able to opt out of them. And if these food products allow wages to stay where they are, food poverty will still occur. It's just that people will be eating different composite foods.
OK, so I'm trying to imagine what you're suggesting here, and that is perhaps that there is a homogenous food market of this mass-produced laboratory stuff, and there's a black market for the very best truffles, wines.
Absolutely. The people that still see food as an endemic part of their culture. I'm a mother. I'm a daughter. Well, I had 17 for lunch on Christmas Day. What I put on that table was about me and my self-identity. Now that and when we look at self-identity in food, we're seeing people that are self-identifying as vegan. We're seeing people that are self-identifying as flexitarian, pescatarian. We're seeing a huge amount of redefining of people by the food they purchase and consume. And this will add to it.
In a good or a bad way?
I think
divisive way or a bringing together way?
The challenge will be that some of the highly processed foods, what will be the labelling? Will I know that when it says milk protein, that came from a cow? Right now, we have laws in the UK around what we can describe as milk. We don't around the world. So I could pick a product up that is labelled as milk or vegan milk, which does not come from a mammal. So there's some really, really challenging questions.
Could be very divisive, couldn't it?
Yeah, and this is partly why our report comes out. As part of our remit, we want to tell people, look, this technology could come, and we need to ask these questions now, right? Because, if it is on the cusp, we could get to the point in 5-10 years when it's already here without people realising. So it's important that we ask these questions because we want to mitigate those downside risks. We want to prepare people for the job losses that could happen, also start retraining people, but also just be aware of those issues that are going to happen for the regulatory reasons.
But is it inevitable that this is going... We're talking about something that 5 years ago, perhaps if I'd sat here, I'd have sort of said, well, this could be just a vision for the future. But, are we talking about something that is definitely coming?
It's coming, yes, but where it will go, we don't know. So certainly these technologies are being developed. Some of them look like they're moving quite quickly. Some of them look like they might be moving a little bit more slowly. I'm not a technological determinist. I don't just think the existence of a technology necessarily has a set of outcomes that can be predictable. And I think the sort of debates that we're having right here, right now, but on a much broader scale, can shape those kind of trajectories, those types of developments. Because there's a very clear political narrative, as well as the economic narrative of the price parity, that's framing how this is being imagined, the vision you're talking about, and what people say it's going to do. But that political discussion can change, and there could be all kinds of flexibilities in these diverse range of foods.
Huge spectrum, isn't there, of what could happen? And we don't, obviously, we've got this report, we say this technology is coming, but we do acknowledge that how we get there there's, as you say, many different journeys. So it's really important to acknowledge that.
I'm wondering how our country will look in 100 years' time if we don't have cows, we don't have sheep, we don't have wheat crops. What do you think it'll be?
Or will we just pay farmers to have them to be lawnmowers?
Exactly. What's the purpose for a cow?
What is the purpose of a cow? Will we redesign what the purpose of a sheep is? If we say that tourism in the Lake District has to look a certain way, as we have the agriculture bill that's going through right now, payment for environmental services, will we redefine a sheep as a lawnmower? I don't know. And that's part of society. You could...
If you redefine it as a lawnmower,
Yes.
presumably it has to go for servicing, but can you still eat it when you feel like it?
Well, you could do. You could do. But this is the fundamental, what you were saying. We are about to fundamentally change with our agriculture bill the way we look at food production in the UK. We're going to fundamentally change how we consider the role of animals in our landscape, the role of farmers in our landscape. The challenge for me is very few people are in the conversation. And we need to be able to allow a whole range of people to come into the conversation about how they want their food produced.
Well, we've had 4 of you in the conversation today. Thank you very, very much indeed. What you see on your plate in 30, 40 years' time may look the same as it does now, but it may well have come from a very different source. That is S-O-U-R-C-E as opposed to S-A-U-C-E. But you didn't need me to point that out, did you? I'm David Foster. Thank you for watching Roundtable. From my guests and from the team, we hope to have your company next time. Goodbye for now.